In this video, we're going to talk about content and language objectives. To begin, I want to think about kind of the bigger purpose of why we write objectives in the first place, and then we'll focus specifically on the difference between content and language objectives. So, what is the purpose of a language objective? Why do teachers write them? Well, language objectives are useful because they identify the specific knowledge and/or skills that students will be practicing and working to master as a result of the lesson. So we can think of lesson objectives as kind of the guidepost for our lesson. What is it that we want students to know or to be able to do after they've completed this lesson or after they've participated in this lesson and the associated learning activities? So, for example, a lesson objective might look like this. Students will be able to describe the process of photosynthesis. So at the end of my lesson, I want all of my students to be able to do this. Students will be able to identify 3 causes of the French Revolution. Students will be able to add double-digit numbers. So they're targeted. You can see the skills or the bodies of knowledge that I want my students to be able to learn or do by the end of the lesson. So a few things to keep in mind when we're writing objectives are they should be specific and observable or measurable. So you notice in those 3 examples, I used words like describe, identify, and add. I didn't say learn, know, and understand because I can't observe that. If I say students should be able to understand the causes of the French Revolution, great, but I can't as a teacher actually know if they understand. What is it that I'm trying to see if they understand? And if I say identify the causes, then I know, okay, they're identifying or they're just describing it or they're comparing, right? So being really specific about what it is that you want students to be able to do allows you to better be able to observe and measure if they actually were able to do that. They're connected to grade level standards. So these examples were kind of just pulled out to show you with the structure, but when I'm writing a lesson objective, I do want to tie it back to the standards for the state standards I'm using for my grade level and the content area that I'm teaching. They're shared with students. So good lesson objectives are not just for the teacher and planning, but they're actually explicitly shared with students in student-friendly language so that students know what it is they're learning. So you could go back to one of the examples and you could say, all right, today, by the end of today's lesson, I want all of you to be able to add 2-digit numbers. So it's explicit to students, you say it, you write it, you have them repeat it. So all the students know, kind of giving them the roadmap for where you're heading in that lesson. And also they're assessed. So you want to have some way of knowing, was this actually successful? This was my goal. Did students actually learn that knowledge or gain that skill as a result of the lesson? So this is all thinking about lesson or objectives broadly, right? So that we are all on the same starting point starting page for why we need an objective in the first place. Now, in this video specifically, I want to get you thinking about the nuanced difference between a content objective and a language objective, and why we would need both. So if you are in an education program, I imagine many of you have learned about content objectives, but perhaps have spent less time thinking about their counterpart. So let's talk a little bit about the nuanced difference here. So a content objective is focused on what knowledge or skill students will develop as a result of the lesson. So all of the examples I just shared with you were content objectives, the knowledge or skill that they're developing through the lesson. A language objective, on the other hand, answers the question, how will language be used to engage with and demonstrate mastery of the content? Or what language are students learning and using to be able to engage with that knowledge or skill or show that they've mastered that knowledge or skill? So they're interconnected. So let's look at some examples. And for each of these, I'm giving you the content area standard first to show you that I am connecting it to a standard. So a standard for 3rd grade science. And then I'll show you a sample content objective that would be for a lesson and the language objective that we would be working on in that same lesson. So in a 3rd grade science lesson on states of matter, the standard that we might be working toward is students learn that matter has 3 forms, solid, liquid, and gas. Now, this is something we might be working on for several lessons, right? That's like a big learning standard. But for this specific lesson, the content objective is students will be able to distinguish between liquids, solids, and gases and provide an example of each. So I'm being more specific about they have to be able to tell the difference, right? Distinguish between these 3 forms of matter and give an example. What are they doing? So there's the knowledge or skill that they're developing. What they're doing with language, or my language goal, is I want students to be able to orally describe characteristics of liquids, solids, and gases using the terms definite shape, molecules, and volume. So here I'm identifying the function of language they're describing, and they're doing so orally, and the specific language forms that I want them to be working on. In this case, I picked vocabulary that I want them to be using: definite shape, molecules, and volume. Let's look at another example. All right, 4th grade math, learning about two-dimensional figures. The content area standard for this one is draw and identify lines and angles and classify shapes by properties of their lines and angles. So I want students, so this is again a nice big standard that they're drawing lines and angles and they're classifying shapes based on these lines and angles. For this particular lesson, the content objective is students should be able to classify triangles based on their angles. So I've narrowed my lesson into a specific shape that we're working on. And the content learning goal here is they're classifying them. So you can see in the image in the corner there, the different types of triangles based on their angles. That's the knowledge or skill. The language objective here for this lesson is students will be able to compare triangles based on their angles using comparative adjectives like greater than, equal to, and less than in writing. So here you see specifically what I want them to do with language. They're classifying triangles. That's the content goal. That's the knowledge or skill. With language, they're going to be using comparative adjectives. This angle is greater than, this angle is equal to 90 degrees, this angle is less than 90 degrees in their writing as they're comparing triangles. So that's what they're doing with language in this lesson to meet the content objective. All right, one more example. 2nd grade social studies, a unit on bringing about change. We're going to be learning about Cesar Chavez in this unit, and the standard that we're addressing is give examples of people and events that brought important changes to a neighborhood and or community. So that's the goal that's connected to a social studies standard. So the objective for this particular lesson is students will be able to describe how Cesar Chavez advocated for migrant farm workers through the Delano grape strike of 1965 to 1970. So we're going to be reading this book, and students, after engaging with this book and our discussion, they're going to be able to describe how he advocated for workers through that strike. So what are they doing with language? That's our knowledge or skill. I want them to be able to orally explain the impact of the Delano grape strike on migrant farm workers using causal language, such as due to, since, because, and as a result. So that's the specific language we're going to be practicing and using as we're describing how Cesar Chavez advocated and the specific impact that the strike had on the migrant farm workers. So you can see the interconnection again between content and language objectives. So that's it. That's what they are. This is the template that I use for writing language objectives. I found it to be kind of helpful to organize my thinking when I'm crafting the objective and connecting it to the content objective and standard. So I'll walk you through it, and then you're going to have an application activity after this. So the template is students will be able to language function, which is how are they using language to describe, to explain, to compare. Content topic, so that's what connects you back to your content objective. Using language forms, and that's where you specifically say what the language should look like or sound like. So it could be vocabulary, but also could be certain types of words like transition words. It could be explanatory language, comparative language. It could be learning the narrative structure. So anything that, whatever that language will look like, whatever aspect of language you want to focus on goes under language forms. And then in domain. So is it happening in reading, in speaking, in writing, or in listening, or while they're listening? So just to use this template to map onto the examples I gave you. So the 4th grade math one again was compare triangles using comparative adjectives in writing. You see all those 4 components. Our 3rd grade example was orally describe characteristics of liquid, solids, and gases using the terms definite shape, molecules, and volume. So you can see all of those components there. All right. Now it's your turn. So this video is about to end. And after this video is done, I want you to click on the Padlet link that's below this video. And I want you to post an example of a content objective and a language objective. And use the template to draft your language objective. You're welcome to pick any grade level or content area, but I want you to just practice, try out what it would be like to write a content goal for a lesson, and then to write an associated language goal with the specific function and forms that you'd be working on, and you'd be supporting students to engage with in the lesson. And I look forward to seeing your examples on the Padlet.